Grundy, Building Accessible Components.
Hi. Oh, it's working. That's nice. Hi, everyone. I hope you've had a good day so far. If you were here last year, or if you were at AliCamp last year, or possibly at one of the web directions last year, you might have seen Cordelia Dillon talk about the Great Accessibility Bake-Off, where where accessibility is like a blueberry muffin. You can't just poke the blueberries in afterwards, you have to bake them in from the beginning. And this is something that we often, people in accessibility talk about very frequently. Build your accessibility in from the beginning, always. When we measure accessibility and we do audits and testing, we're doing that at a page-by-page level because there's no point having an accessible half a page. But when we're building, we're often building like components and chunks, and it's becoming more common now as more modularized building systems are being used, React, a lot of that. So what I thought I'd do is share my process that I follow when I'm building an accessible component. It's not that it's the only way to do this, it's just a way that works for me, and hopefully it'll be useful to you. What I've chosen for, I should pick up my slide thingo. I've chosen to make a demonstration component, a Datepicker. I chose Datepickers because most of the plugins that you can get for them are terrible for accessibility. It's partly because Datepickers are really complex. It's not that people don't mean well, it's that it's hard to do right, as I discovered as I built this. So what Alison Ennis, yes, I don't know if she's in the room today, but yesterday we were chatting and she said, when you take care of the pennies, the pounds take care of themselves. If you make an accessible Datepicker the first time that you build it, it means you'll have so many fewer accessibility errors when you get to the end and you assess your entire page. So it's worth taking the trouble to get these kinds of things right. A lot of my process is built off what my colleague Devon Persing calls the accessibility stack. She wrote an article about it called Making a Better Layer Cake, between the blueberries and Lainey and her cookies. I think accessibility people are just very hungry overall. The accessibility stack, these are the technologies. HTML, CSS, JavaScript and ARIA are the technologies and languages that we use to make an accessible experience. HTML and CSS are the most robust. They're accessible out of the box unless you start doing weird things to them. Fewer people can take advantage of CSS because fewer people can see it. JavaScript, and when I talk JavaScript here, I'm not talking about Node or React or frameworks that are purely for the developer. I'm talking about the parts of JavaScript where we interact with the user or allow the user to interact with us. And ARIA is wonderful, but often over-relied on as an accessibility technology. It's really only relevant to screen reader users. I'm hoping with more voice control technology coming out, I'm hoping that a lot of ARIA will be picked up there as well. But it's nice to have. It can make a boring and technically accessible experience user-friendly and pleasant to use. So it's always worth adding, but it shouldn't be the focus of most of our time. The accessible process that I follow, 4 steps. Build your base HTML layer, make it work with JavaScript, style it with CSS, and enhance it with ARIA and goodies. You'll notice that the JavaScript and the CSS have changed order from our accessibility stack. I found that if I started with the CSS immediately after the HTML, I spent a lot of time making it beautiful or attempting to make it beautiful, and I would run out of time to actually make it work. So I've started pushing the JavaScript earlier. If you don't have the extreme love of CSS that I do, you may not need to do that. If you're working on native platforms, the technology might be different, but the process is similar, working with that base and then gradually layering on and thinking of design and ARIA and all of these things as enhancements. So to get into it, first we're going to build our base HTML layer. This is actually before I begin. This is my beautiful form that I have. I should have done this after listening to Russ's presentation. I'm using Moment.js, which handles the JavaScript date object and wraps around it and makes it just so much nicer to use. It tells you what the date is, you type in a date, you click submit, it reformats it for you in a very nice way. Very sophisticated programming going on here. I also have an error message. I've used the wrapping around method that Russ talked about, but I do have a generic message, sorry. This is actually before I've even begun my component. This is what we're starting with. And I don't want my date picker to override this. If somebody has an autocomplete set up, so if there's like their birth date, save them the trouble of typing it in. Let them use the text input. Don't force them to use a date picker. The date picker is an enhancement. It's there for the people who might want to look around at the dates and see what the options are. That's nice. I'm not going to, I think I said earlier, I'm not going to go too much into the code. It's more about what I'm making and why than the specific methods. There's a lot of different ways to achieve the same goal. If you have preferred methods, that's great. This is my navigation. It's got a heading and a button to close my date picker, a button for the previous month and a button for the next month. I'll just draw your attention to the tab index, the negative tab index on the heading. That's because later on I'm going to use that to send focus to that heading. So that's just there for the moment. Next, I'm going to add a table to contain all of my dates. I have seen some date pickers that use a list element for this. That's okay. It provides structure, and at least you know how many list items you have. But for a screen reader user and a keyboard user, you must navigate that in a strictly linear order. So if you want to choose the 31st of July, you have to go through the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, all the way through. A table provides keyboard shortcuts and extra navigation options, at least for screen reader users, so that you can sort of go down by the column or the row instead, which is a lot faster. The problem with a table, I'll just add there, I've also added a scope of column. This programmatically associates the name of the day, and so when someone navigates to Saturday the 31st, it's announced as Saturday 31st, not just 31st. The problem with using tables for layout in a date picker is that almost all of the big plugins then start attaching click events to the table cells. Table cells aren't natively taking focus, so then you have to add an event listener for your keyboard and then for your touch and then probably soon for voice control. So we'll be adding listeners for our listening. It's all getting a bit too much when you could just put a form input in there and have one function that covers it all. Form inputs natively take focus. You don't have to mess around with anything. Every device recognizes form inputs. You could use radio buttons. I've seen this done where they wanted to absolutely ensure that people were only picking one date and not several. And they were using like lovely label stylings to hide the actual control, but make it look pretty. You can also use checkboxes if you actually wanted people to select more than one date. I prefer buttons because I just find them more flexible. If you are using the same base component for several types of date picker, a button can be more easily managed into different things. It's also easier to style, and I'm kind of lazy, so here we go. So this is my beautiful HTML version. It doesn't actually do anything yet, so let's make it work. The first thing I want to do is actually make sure that no one actually sees the date picker unless JavaScript's available. If you have suffered, as I have, under unreliable NBN, you know that JavaScript can just drop out at any moment, just fails to load. So what I do is I add a class of hidden, display none, takes the elements out of the DOM, and then I use JavaScript. When the JavaScript is loaded, I use it to remove those hidden elements. That way, I know my JavaScript is loaded if people are seeing this button. And it just prevents people from having a button going, open date picker, what does that do? Click, 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 nothing. So it's just a little fail-safe kind of thing that I like to do. There's my lovely button, and What's coming up next? Oh, I'm going to make the toggle control the date picker. Again, the code itself is not relevant. I'm just using plain JavaScript. I am using, I grabbed from the W3C's examples their accessible modal to put this into. I'm not sure I'd recommend it, but the other accessible modals that I found relied on jQuery, and I wanted to use plain JavaScript. So this was the only accessible plain JavaScript one I could find. It's very grabby with your focus. So if you want to do anything with focus while your modal is open, you're going to have to work a little bit harder. There we go. It's in a modal. Delightful. I've added a close button already and added a function for that, not terribly difficult. I've also added, this is probably the most keyboard listening that I do is for the escape keys. I always want to make sure that people, if they've opened the date picker by mistake and they're like, oh no, I don't want that, hit the escape key, get out of there. Then I'm replacing the table, my hard-coded table with script. The hard-coded table helps me understand what I'm building, but I don't actually want to maintain a gazillion tables for every possible month that might be used in this date picker. This is what computers are good at. Great, let them do it. The next thing, oh yeah, functions for my navigation controls. I have to look at my slides to see what I'm going to say next. Functions for navigation controls, fairly straightforward. Go forward 1 month, go back 1 month. I'm adding, if you remember when I added the negative tab index to the heading earlier, that's so that when someone clicks a previous or a next, focus moves up to that heading, and as the heading gets updated to say, oh, now we're in June, not July, people who can't see the screen get notified of it. It's a simple, basic kind of thing. Again, doesn't rely on ARIA, just keeps us down lower in that accessibility stack. The other thing that I do for a date picker that I probably wouldn't do with any other type of form element is actually disable any controls which are out of scope. So if, for example, your date picker doesn't contain, every month since the beginning of time to the heat death of the universe, you want to at some point limit it. At some point you need to say there is no previous month that you can select, there is no previous date that you can select. So I've added an attribute of disabled to the buttons that are out of scope. I find in user testing that this works for the kinds of situations where I've been working on things. It helps people if they've been clicking the previous button and then all of a sudden it's gone. You think, well, have I missed it? Or if you are on the 17th and you're trying to get back to the 16th and it's not there, that's kind of like you think, oh, did I miss it? Or is it my fault? By putting the disabled button there with the disabled attribute, screen reader users who can't see it can still get that information that, oh, it's there, I just can't pick it. Normally, in a form, I tend not to use disabled buttons. I think if you can't use it, why is it there? Don't show it until you need it. This, I think, though, provides a little bit more context for a complex interaction. Finally, we get to the part that a date picker is for. We get to pick a date. Lovely. Basically just sort of keeping track of some variables, clearing out any previous attempts, and what the date picker does, when someone clicks a date button, it sends that date back to the input. Not very sophisticated, but really reliable. And so all of my validation and all of that is sitting in the form, not in the date picker. It helps, again, simplify and keep this component independent. You might need to reuse it in lots of ways, so that way you've kind of got the specific use case and business logic separate from your actual component. Who's ready to see an animation of a really, really awesome date picker?
Bring it.
Tabbing around. Oh, amazing. Isn't that just, whoa. As you can see, I'm super proud of my excellent component. It is still kind of ugly. Oh, I should describe that. Yes, audio description. What happened was I opened up my original form, tabbed past the text input, clicked the open date picker button, which opened a modal. I navigated to click the previous month button, navigated through the dates, clicked the 19, which then closed the modal, sent focus back to the text input, and then I tabbed through to the submit button, and after I clicked the submit button, it said you have chosen Friday, June 19th, 2020. I'm not actually sure why it says 2020 because I was working on 2018. Who knows? It's buggy. It's a demo, okay? So it's still quite ugly. So I'm not a designer. I'm so not a designer, but I love playing with CSS. I won't bore you with all of my amazing attempts at styling. I cleaned up the table. I'll just point out a few things that I did for accessibility. I've moved my close button up to the standard location for close buttons for modals. It fails 2.1. It passes 2.0 of WCAG because this is an accessible SVG and it has appropriate alt content. But for 2.1, you'll be wanting to actually have the word close there to make it absolutely clear what's going on. This is my disabled previous month button, looking quite distinct from the active or usable button. This is my selected date. Again, making sure that it's visually distinct from unselected dates. And I've got a little bit of a hover focus effect, again, distinct from the previous two. That's usually the hard part with a date picker is distinguishing standard objects, hovered and focus objects, and selected objects, is making sure you have enough style variation to cover all of these. We'll just take a quick look at how this goes in some standard tools that people with low vision might be using. This is it. This is the modal zoomed in. It works quite well because I haven't put a lot of constraints on the size in terms of containers and fonts. Looks quite nice. This is it when text only is resized. Not as attractive, but still very usable. And this is how it looks in high contrast. I'm not 100% happy with the hover and focus effects. They're obvious when you're actually moving around on the page, but in a screen grab, they're not very distinct. And as you can see, my selected date is really not showing up. So that's another thing that I want to improve on my next version of my demo. Next, we get to enhancing this. This is a pretty standard date picker. It picks dates. We could do better than that. I mean, who comes to an accessibility conference and just wants basic accessibility? We want better. So what we've got is, the first thing I'm going to do is replace that selected class for my selected dates with ARIA. At the moment, because that class, oops, there we go, the class on the button is selected, screen reader users aren't going to know that little bit of information is there. They'll know because they clicked it, but it's hard to keep track of these things. And what if you tap away and come back, you're like, oh, which one did I pick? It's nice. It's a nice usability feature. So I've used ARIA current selected, and I've added that to my CSS as an attribute selector in CSS. I find using ARIA attributes in my CSS helps tie together that programmatic and visual markers. It makes it a bit easier to maintain and make sure that you're not forgetting one or the other when you use the ARIA as the hook. Your mileage may vary, depends on what your workflow is like, but for me that works quite well. The other bit of ARIA that I've done is, earlier I had that tab index and the focus. It's nice, it works well, but we can do better for the people who have ARIA. What I've done is I've added an ARIA Live Polite. If you saw Russ's talks on ARIA earlier, you would know that that just waits until a polite moment to say, July, we've changed to July. And I've removed, or I've commented out the part where I use focus to update instead. Again, you could just skip to this part and not build it at first. I've been interrupted on projects often enough that I like to start with the basics first in case I don't get time to come back and finish it later. Again, nothing wrong though with going straight to this kind of method if you know you're going to be able to do it. I did have some talk about animation. Due to technical difficulties, it didn't work. Binding animation events to dynamically generated buttons inside a table inside a modal that is grabbing my focus turned out to be super hard. And the only things I could animate were things which should not be animated. You don't need your close button zigzagging all over the place. But there are cognitive benefits to accessibility, to animation, sorry. When you're transitioning from one state to the next, when you're sliding through time on a date picker, it's helpful to just animate these state transitions. When you're opening up a modal and closing it, a gentle, subtle, not too much bling kind of animation can really support people who are momentarily distracted or have a cognitive impairment. They can sort of go, what happened? Oh, right, okay, it grew out of that. This is helpful. For the purposes of 2.1, WCAG 2.1, you want to make sure that you're not imposing this animation on people who don't want it. This is where I would like to experiment a bit with the prefers reduced motion query in CSS. I think that'll be quite helpful to make sure that only people who want animation are getting it. You've probably noticed through my 4 steps that I haven't actually stuck to just HTML, just JavaScript, just CSS at each step. There's a bit of back and forth because they all integrate and support each other. So you could see it more as a cycle, an iterative cycle, rather than a process. But I find when I think of it in that way, I never stop working on it, and then nothing else ever gets built. So at some point, I find it helpful to say, do you know what? No, it's 4 steps. Just get on with it. But I do kind of modify my final process to take out the actual mentions of technology and just say, look, build a semantic base, make it interactive, style it, enhance it. A lot of my thinking about enhancing from a solid base comes from early web pioneer type people, including Jeremy Keith, who had a really excellent talk a couple of years ago at an event apart called Enhance. And he talks about how HTML and CSS have a structural integrity and honesty. They're reliable sort of materials that you can use anywhere, anytime. Once you start getting into JavaScript and animation and ARIA, not everybody can perceive them. Not everybody wants to perceive them. Sometimes, as with JavaScript, it just drops out. I think this is particularly relevant to accessibility. We're not just trying to make our stuff work in different browsers. We're trying to make it work in any input device, any output device. And so relying on that HTML base is really, really super helpful and gets you thinking in the right way about what's the least technology that I can use to make this happen. So if you haven't seen that talk, do give it a go. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to discover that there are any captions for it, which is a bit of a shame. I think that's about it. I've got some resources up, including the code on GitHub. I'm actually really hoping that somebody in here will look at my Datepicker and go, that's nice demo, or we could do better than that. If you do, please make a plugin and let me know about it so that I can use it. I would really love, because as it is, as what I discovered from making this is that Datepickers are hard. There's a lot of different functionality. A lot of it depends on your use case. Having to make it cater to all of those different aspects is quite difficult. So it probably takes a team with design and UX and user testing and all of this. I wouldn't recommend that anyone actually use this code live unless you are really desperate. Just stick with that text input that we started with. That'll be nice. But yeah, if you do take this and run with it and try and make some improvements or have some suggestions, please let me know. I really love seeing what people do when they apply their minds to this kind of thing. Thank you.
Alley Camp, October 2018.